I'm Juliet Hartworth, 34, and I earned my place in the military the hard way, through deployments, discipline, and years of sacrifice. For years, I sent money home, showed up when my family needed me, and tried to earn my father's respect. But when he stood in front of a crowd and called me nothing but a failure while praising my brother-in-law as his real pride, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by the very person you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to reclaim your worth after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about standing your ground. What happened next might surprise you. I learned early that my father's love came with conditions. Not the kind spelled out in some contract, but the unspoken ones that hung in the air every time I walked into a room. His approval was currency I could never quite earn enough of, no matter how hard I tried. Dad was a respected man in our town. Owned a successful construction company, coached youth baseball for 15 years, served on the city council. People looked up to him, asked his opinion on everything from local politics to which contractor to hire. He carried himself like a man who knew his worth, and he expected his family to reflect that same standard back to the world. I tried. God knows I tried. In high school, I ran track and played volleyball, maintained a 3.8 GPA, worked summers at his construction sites hauling materials and learning to read blueprints. When other kids were partying, I was training or studying, pushing myself harder because I thought that's what would make him proud. But his praise never came easy. When I made varsity track as a sophomore, he nodded and said, "Good. Now let's see if you can actually win something." When I graduated with honors, he mentioned how my cousin Lucy had been valedictorian at her school. Always a comparison, always a way to remind me I hadn't quite reached the bar he'd set. My mother tried to smooth things over. "You know how your father is," she'd say. "He just wants you to be your best." But I saw how his face lit up when he talked about other people's achievements. The neighbor's son who got into West Point. His friend's daughter who became a doctor. There was a warmth in his voice then that I rarely heard when my name came up. So when I turned 18, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I walked into the Army recruitment office on a Tuesday morning in March and signed the papers. Not out of rebellion or some dramatic gesture, but because I thought military service might finally be something he could respect. The recruiter, Sergeant Martinez, asked me what I wanted to do in the Army. I told her I wanted to serve my country, which was true, but the deeper truth was that I wanted to prove I was worthy of my father's pride. She talked about different career paths, the benefits, the challenges of military life. What she didn't mention was how it would change everything about who I was and who I thought I could become. Basic training broke me down and built me back up in ways I hadn't expected. The physical demands were brutal but manageable. The mental challenges pushed me harder than I'd ever been pushed. But something clicked during those weeks. For the first time in my life, I wasn't measuring myself against my father's expectations. I was measuring myself against the mission, against my fellow soldiers, against standards that had nothing to do with hometown approval. I excelled. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered in a way nothing else had mattered before. My drill sergeants noticed. My scores reflected it. When I graduated, I wasn't the same girl who'd walked into that recruitment office looking for validation. Dad came to my graduation ceremony. Sat in the bleachers with Mom, clapped when my name was called. Afterward, he shook my hand and said I looked good in uniform. It wasn't the enthusiastic pride I'd hoped for, but it was something. A small acknowledgement that maybe I'd chosen a respectable path. But the real test came with deployment. First to Germany for specialized training, then to forward operating bases in Afghanistan. The work was demanding, dangerous, and often thankless. Long days, longer nights, constant vigilance. We operated in small teams, gathering intelligence, coordinating with local forces, executing missions that required precision and trust. I discovered I had a talent for the work. The attention to detail my father had drilled into me at construction sites served me well in military operations. The discipline I'd learned trying to earn his approval became discipline that kept my team safe. The drive to prove myself transformed into something more valuable. The drive to serve something bigger than myself. During those deployments, I sent money home whenever I could. Not much, but enough to help when Dad's business hit rough patches during the recession. I wrote letters, though he rarely wrote back. Called when I could get to a phone, though our conversations stayed surface level. How was the weather back home? How was business? How was Mom? He never asked about my work, not really. Never asked about the missions or the challenges or what it was like being one of the few women in my unit. When I did try to share something, he'd change the subject or make some comment about how different the military was back in his day, though he'd never served. The financial support I provided went unacknowledged. The sacrifices I was making seemed invisible to him. When I came home on leave, he'd introduce me to people as my daughter who joined the Army, with about as much enthusiasm as he'd used to mention that I'd joined the local book club. Meanwhile, my sister married a guy named Alexander. Good guy, served in special forces, had all the right credentials to impress Dad. Suddenly, family gatherings became showcases for Alexander's achievements. Dad would corner people at barbecues to tell them about Alexander's deployments, Alexander's commendations, Alexander's leadership roles. I listened from the kitchen or the back porch, washing dishes or helping Mom with dinner preparations, while Dad held court about his son-in-law's military career. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, actively serving, actively deployed to the same theaters Alexander had served in, and Dad treated him like the family's military expert while barely acknowledging my service. But I told myself it didn't matter. I was building something meaningful in my career, earning respect from people who understood the work I was doing. My commanding officers recognized my capabilities. My teammates trusted me with their lives. That had to be enough. Still, in quiet moments between missions or during long watches, I found myself imagining what it would feel like to hear my father say he was proud of me. Not qualified pride, not conditional approval, but the kind of unrestrained enthusiasm he showed when talking about other people's children. I kept hoping that someday, something I did would finally bridge that gap between us. Some achievement or recognition that would make him see me the way I'd always wanted to be seen. It took years for me to understand that the gap wasn't about my achievements at all. Family gatherings became exercises in careful navigation. I'd come home on leave, and Dad would spend dinner talking about Alexander's latest assignment or promotion. Alexander, to his credit, tried to include me in those conversations, asked about my work, treated me with professional respect. But Dad's focus remained laser-fixed on his son-in-law's career. The comparisons started subtly. Alexander's unit just got back from a really tough deployment, Dad would say, and then look at me. What are you working on these days? As if my assignments were somehow less significant, less dangerous, less worthy of discussion. At first, I laughed it off. Told myself he was just proud of having a special forces operator in the family, that it didn't diminish what I was doing. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every conversation somehow circled back to Alexander's achievements, while mine got relegated to polite afterthoughts. My mother noticed the dynamic, but didn't know how to address it. She'd try to redirect conversations, bring up my promotions or training milestones, but Dad would nod politely and change the subject. It was as if he decided that Alexander represented the family's military honor, and my service was just a footnote to that larger story. The unease I'd been feeling crystallized into something harder to dismiss. This wasn't about old-fashioned attitudes or generational differences. This was about respect, and the growing realization that I might never earn it, no matter what I accomplished. I started limiting my calls home, keeping conversations brief and surface level. When relatives asked about my work, I gave generic answers. The enthusiasm I'd once had for sharing my experiences with family faded into resignation. It seemed easier to keep my professional life separate from family dynamics than to keep hoping for recognition that might never come. But part of me, the part that had spent years trying to earn his approval, kept believing that someday something would change. Some moment would arrive when he'd finally see me clearly, acknowledge what I'd accomplished, treat me with the same pride he showed when talking about Alexander. I had no idea that moment was coming or how completely it would change everything between us. The invitation came on a Tuesday in October. The local Veterans of Foreign Wars Post was organizing a ceremony to honor service members from our county. Dad had been asked to speak as a community leader, and the family was invited to attend. It would be the first time in years that all of us would be together at a public event. I was on leave, visiting home for the first time in 8 months. The deployment had been particularly intense, though I hadn't shared details with my family. Operational security aside, they'd never shown much interest in the specifics of my work. It seemed easier to keep things general, let them assume I spent my time in administrative roles or routine security duty. Mom was excited about the ceremony. "It'll be nice to have everyone together," she said, pressing my dress uniform. "And your father is looking forward to speaking. He's been working on his remarks for weeks." I should have felt honored to be included, proud that Dad wanted the family there for his speech. Instead, I felt a familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. Public events with Dad meant public performances of family unity, and I'd learned to be cautious about how those performances might unfold. Alexander arrived the morning of the ceremony, looking sharp in his dress uniform. He and my sister had driven down from their base, making it a real family reunion. Dad was in his element, fussing over details, making sure everyone knew their role in the evening's proceedings. "This is important for the community," he told us over breakfast. "People need to hear from families who understand service, who've made sacrifices." He looked around the table, his gaze settling on Alexander. "It's good to have someone here who can really speak to what military service means." I kept my expression neutral, but the message was clear. Alexander was the military authority in our family. I was just another attendee. The venue was the high school auditorium, decorated with flags and memorial wreaths. The local paper had sent a photographer. County officials sat in the front row, along with Gold Star families and decorated veterans. It felt formal, important, the kind of event that would be remembered and talked about for months afterward. I took my seat with the family, 3 rows from the front. Alexander sat between Dad and my sister, engaging in quiet conversation about military traditions and ceremony protocols. I listened to them discuss proper flag etiquette and the significance of various service ribbons, feeling increasingly like an observer rather than a participant. When Dad was introduced, he walked to the podium with confidence. He'd always been comfortable speaking in public, and tonight was no different. He began with remarks about community values, the importance of supporting service members, the debt we owe to those who serve. Then he shifted to personal remarks. "As a father," he said, "I've had the privilege of watching young people in my own family choose to serve their country." The audience settled in, expecting heartwarming stories about family military tradition. "My daughter here," he gestured toward me, and I felt every eye in the auditorium turn my way, joined the Army some years ago. "She's served overseas, and I'm sure she's done her best." The words hit like physical blows. Done her best. As if my service was some hobby I'd tried, some phase I'd gone through. The polite applause felt like pity, and I forced myself to smile and nod while inside I was crumbling. But Dad wasn't finished. He gestured toward Alexander, his voice gaining energy and warmth. "But I want you to meet someone who really exemplifies what service means. My son-in-law here is a Special Forces commander, a real warrior who's led men in combat and earned the respect of his peers through genuine achievement." The applause was louder now, more enthusiastic. Alexander stood briefly, acknowledged the recognition with appropriate modesty, then sat back down. But I could see his discomfort, the way he glanced at me with something that looked like embarrassment. Dad continued, building on his theme. "When young people ask me about military service, I tell them to look at examples like Alexander. That's what real dedication looks like. That's what makes a community proud." I sat frozen, processing the public dismissal of everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed. Around me, people were nodding and smiling, appreciating Dad's heartfelt tribute to military service. They had no idea that his words had just shredded his own daughter's dignity in front of half the town. The ceremony continued, but I barely heard the rest. My mind kept replaying his words, the casual way he dismissed my service as adequate while elevating Alexander's as exemplary. In front of everyone who mattered in our community, he'd made it clear which of us he considered worthy of real respect. When the formal program ended, people mingled in the lobby. Several approached Alexander to thank him for his service, ask about his experiences, express admiration for his career. A few offered me polite nods, the kind you give to someone who'd been present but not particularly significant. I stood near the back wall, trying to process what had just happened. Years of service, multiple deployments, countless sacrifices, and in one speech, Dad had reduced it all to a footnote to Alexander's more impressive military career. That's when Alexander approached me. He looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to begin. "Listen," he said quietly, "what your dad said up there." I started to deflect, to make some polite comment about family dynamics, but Alexander's expression stopped me. He looked almost stricken, like he'd seen something that shook him. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "What exactly did you do over there? In Afghanistan, I mean. What was your actual assignment?" I hesitated. Operational security meant I couldn't discuss specifics, but Alexander had clearance levels that might make general conversation possible. Still, years of keeping work separate from family made me cautious. "Intelligence support mostly," I said. "Small team operations. Nothing too dramatic." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with the kind of recognition that made my stomach tighten. "What unit were you with?" I told him, watching his face carefully. His reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The color drained from his cheeks, and his hand actually trembled as he reached out to steady himself against the wall. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "You're the ghost of Kandahar." The words hung between us like an electric charge. Around us, people continued their casual conversations about community service and patriotic duty, completely unaware that Alexander had just identified me by a designation I'd hoped would stay buried in classified reports and military legend. I didn't confirm or deny it. Couldn't, really. But Alexander's reaction told me everything I needed to know about how completely my father had misunderstood what I'd been doing for the past 8 years. "Holy shit," he breathed, then looked around quickly to make sure no one had overheard. "Do you have any idea? I mean, people in my community, we've heard stories. The intelligence work, the operations that nobody talks about. You're a fucking legend." I felt dizzy, like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. For years, I'd existed in 2 completely separate worlds. In one, I was Dad's disappointing daughter who'd joined the military but never really distinguished herself. In the other, I was someone whose work had earned respect from people who understood exactly what it meant. Now those worlds were colliding in the worst possible way. Alexander was staring at me with something approaching awe. "The Kandahar operations, the intelligence networks you helped establish, the assets you developed, do you know how many lives you saved? How many missions succeeded because of groundwork you laid?" I glanced across the room to where Dad was still holding court, accepting congratulations on his speech, basking in reflected glory from Alexander's military career. He had no idea that the daughter he'd just publicly dismissed was someone whose reputation in certain military circles far exceeded his son-in-law's. "Alexander," I said quietly, "I need you to keep this between us." He looked confused. "Are you kidding? Your father he needs to know who you really are. What you've really done." I shook my head. "It doesn't work that way. And honestly, after tonight, I'm not sure it matters anymore." But even as I said it, I could see Alexander's mental wheels turning. He was processing the implications of what he'd just learned, understanding how completely wrong the evening's narrative had been. We stood there in awkward silence, watching Dad continue his conversations with community leaders, completely unaware that his assessment of his family's military contributions had just been revealed as embarrassingly inaccurate. Alexander looked like he wanted to say something else, but I turned and walked toward the exit. I needed air, needed space to think about what had just happened and what it meant for everything I thought I understood about my place in my family. Outside in the parking lot, I sat in my car and tried to process the evening. Dad's public dismissal had been painful enough, but Alexander's recognition added a layer of complexity I hadn't expected. For the first time, someone in my family knew exactly what I'd accomplished in my military career. And that knowledge made Dad's words not just hurtful, but objectively wrong. I drove home in silence, wondering if anything would ever be the same between us again. The next morning, I woke to find missed calls from Alexander. 3 messages, each more urgent than the last. I deleted them without listening and went for a run, needing the physical exertion to clear my head after the previous night's revelation. When I returned, Mom was in the kitchen making breakfast, humming quietly while she worked. Dad sat at the table reading the local paper, looking satisfied with himself. The morning felt jarringly normal after the emotional earthquake of the previous evening. The ceremony was lovely, Mom said, not looking up from the stove. People are still talking about your father's speech. Mrs. Henderson called this morning to say how moved she was by his words about family service. I poured coffee and sat across from Dad, studying his face for any sign that he understood what his words had done to me. He looked content, pleased with how the evening had unfolded. There was no indication that he'd given any thought to how his public assessment of my service might have affected me. It was a good event, he said, folding the paper. Important for the community to hear from people who understand what real service looks like. The phrase real service hit like a slap. Even now, 12 hours later, he was doubling down on his assessment. In his mind, Alexander represented authentic military achievement while my contributions remained somehow lesser, unworthy of serious consideration. My phone rang. Alexander again. This time I answered. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Can you meet me somewhere private?" I glanced at my parents, still absorbed in their morning routines, still operating under the assumption that last night had been a successful celebration of family values. "Give me an hour," I told him. We met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, away from the social circles where our families moved. Alexander arrived looking like he hadn't slept, his usual composure replaced by something approaching agitation. "I kept thinking about last night," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "About what your father said, and who you really are, and how completely wrong the whole thing was." I started to deflect, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. I've spent the last 8 hours processing this, and I need you to understand something. In my community, the Special Forces community, your work is legendary. Not well known, because most of it's classified, but legendary among people who need to know." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "The intelligence networks you established in Kandahar province saved hundreds of lives. The assets you developed, the information you gathered, it changed how we operated in that entire region. There are guys in my unit who are alive today because of groundwork you laid." I felt something shift inside me, a recognition I'd been avoiding. For years, I'd compartmentalized my professional achievements, keeping them separate from family dynamics. It had been easier to accept Dad's dismissal when I could tell myself that military service was just one part of my identity, not the defining element. But Alexander's words forced me to confront a different truth. I had distinguished myself in ways my father couldn't even imagine. His assessment of my service wasn't just hurtful, it was factually wrong. "The thing is," Alexander continued, "I don't think I can pretend I don't know this. When your father talks about military service, when he holds me up as some kind of example while dismissing what you've done, I can't just sit there and let that happen anymore." I felt a surge of panic. "Alexander, you can't, I know, operational security. I get it. But there has to be some way to set the record straight without compromising classified information." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us grappling with the implications of what he'd discovered. Alexander's knowledge had fundamentally changed the family dynamic, creating an alliance I'd never expected and a responsibility he clearly felt unprepared to handle. "What does my sister know?" I asked. "Nothing specific. She knows you serve, knows you've been deployed, but she doesn't understand the significance of what you've done any more than your parents do." Another layer of complexity. My sister, who'd always existed somewhat outside the dynamic between Dad and me, had no idea that her husband now possessed information that completely reframed our family's military narrative. "I need time to think about this," I told Alexander. He nodded, but I could see the frustration in his expression. He discovered that his father-in-law had publicly humiliated a decorated service member, and his sense of military honor was clearly struggling with the injustice of the situation. "Just, can you give me a few days before you do anything?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "But this can't stay buried forever. It's not right." I left the coffee shop feeling more unsettled than when I'd arrived. Alexander's recognition had validated years of work that had gone unacknowledged by my family, but it had also created a new problem, someone who felt obligated to defend my honor in ways I wasn't sure I was ready to handle. The next few days passed in strange suspension. Dad continued his normal routine, apparently satisfied that the ceremony had gone well and that he'd successfully highlighted the family's military connections. Mom fielded calls from friends praising his speech. Life continued as if nothing fundamental had changed. But everything had changed. I found myself watching Dad differently, listening to his casual comments about military service with new awareness of how completely he misunderstood my contributions. When he mentioned Alexander's career achievements, I heard not just favoritism but ignorance. The dynamic felt unsustainable. Alexander's knowledge hung over every family interaction like a loaded weapon. He treated me with a deference that was noticeable to anyone paying attention, while Dad remained completely oblivious to the shift in underlying power structures. I started making plans to return to base earlier than scheduled. The leave that was supposed to be restful family time had become an exercise in managing competing narratives about who I was and what I'd accomplished. It seemed easier to retreat to the world where my achievements were understood and respected than to navigate the increasingly complex dynamics at home. But I underestimated Alexander's sense of honor and his struggle with maintaining what he now saw as a fundamental deception about our family's military contributions. 3 days after our coffee shop conversation, he called me with urgency in his voice. "There's going to be another event," he said. "Next weekend. The American Legion is hosting a regional gathering, and they've asked your father to introduce the keynote speaker. He wants the whole family there again." My stomach clenched. Another public event, another opportunity for Dad to showcase Alexander while dismissing my service, another performance of family dynamics that were now impossibly complicated by Alexander's knowledge. "I can't do it again," Alexander said quietly. "I can't sit there and watch him diminish what you've accomplished while he holds me up as some kind of gold standard. It's not right, and it's not honest." I understood his position, but I also understood the potential consequences of disrupting the family narrative. Dad's public persona was built on his role as community leader and family patriarch. Having his assessment of his children's achievements challenged in public would be devastating to him. "Give me until the weekend," I said. "Let me figure out how to handle this." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure there was a way to handle it. The gap between public perception and reality had become too wide to bridge without someone getting hurt. I spent the week thinking about boundaries, about respect, about the difference between keeping the peace and enabling disrespect. For years, I'd accepted Dad's dismissal as part of our family dynamic, something to be endured rather than challenged. But Alexander's recognition had forced me to see the situation differently. I wasn't just Dad's disappointing daughter who'd joined the military. I was a decorated service member whose contributions had earned genuine respect from people who understood the work I'd done. The disconnect wasn't about generational differences or communication styles, it was about fundamental fairness and recognition. By Friday, I'd made my decision. I wouldn't attend the American Legion event. I wouldn't subject myself to another public dismissal, and I wouldn't put Alexander in the position of having to choose between family harmony and professional integrity. I told my parents Friday evening over dinner. "I won't be able to make it to the event tomorrow," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I've decided to head back to base early." Dad looked up from his plate, clearly surprised. "Why?" "This is important family time. People will expect to see you there." I met his gaze directly. "I don't think my presence adds anything to these events. You have Alexander to represent the family's military service. That seems to be what people want to hear about." The words carried more weight than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. For the first time, I was acknowledging the dynamic that had been obvious to everyone but apparently invisible to him. Dad's expression shifted, confusion replacing surprise. What's that supposed to mean? Mom looked between us, sensing tension but not understanding its source. Honey, you should come. It's always nice to have the whole family together. I pushed back from the table, suddenly feeling exhausted by the whole conversation. I think it's better this way. You and Alexander can handle the military representation. I'll just be in the way. Dad's face reddened slightly. That's ridiculous. You're part of this family, and military service is military service. The phrase stung more than he could have known. Military service is military service, as if all service was equivalent, as if the distinctions he'd drawn so clearly at the previous event were somehow imaginary. Is it? I asked. Because from where I sit, it seems like some military service gets more recognition than others. The tension in the room became palpable. Mom set down her fork, clearly realizing this conversation was heading somewhere she didn't understand but didn't like. I don't know what you're talking about, Dad said, but his tone suggested he was beginning to sense that his carefully constructed narrative was being questioned. I stood up, suddenly feeling the futility of the whole situation. Never mind. I'll leave early tomorrow morning. You all have a good time at the event. I walked toward the stairs, but Dad's voice stopped me. If you've got something to say it directly. Don't just storm off like a child. I turned back to face him, feeling years of accumulated frustration crystallizing into something sharper and more focused. All right. Last week, in front of the entire community, you introduced me as someone who'd done her best in military service. Then you spent 5 minutes talking about Alexander's achievements as if they represented the real military commitment in our family. You made it clear that his service matters while mine is just adequate effort. Dad looked genuinely taken aback. That's not what I meant, that's exactly what you meant. And it's exactly how everyone in that auditorium heard it. The room fell silent. Mom looked stricken, clearly hearing this dynamic articulated for the first time. Dad's face cycled through several expressions: confusion, defensiveness, something that might have been recognition. I was proud of both of you, he said finally, but the words sounded hollow. No, you weren't. You were proud of Alexander and tolerant of me. There's a difference. I turned and headed upstairs, leaving them to process what had just been said. For the first time in years, I'd stated the truth directly instead of swallowing it and hoping things would somehow change. But I also knew that stating the truth and having it accepted were two very different things. I left early the next morning, before anyone else was awake. The drive back to base gave me time to think about what I'd said and what it meant for my relationship with my family going forward. The American Legion event happened without me. I heard about it later from Alexander, who called to tell me that Dad's speech had been more subdued, less focused on family military service, more general in its themes. He seemed off his game, Alexander said. Like he was thinking about other things while he was speaking. I didn't ask for details. Part of me was curious whether my absence had been noticed, whether Dad had adjusted his remarks because of our conversation. But a larger part of me was relieved to have avoided another public performance of family dynamics I no longer felt obligated to endure. Over the following weeks, my relationship with my family settled into a new pattern. Conversations became more formal, more careful. Dad stopped making casual references to military service when we talked. Mom tried to bridge whatever gap she sensed had opened between us, but she couldn't address problems she didn't fully understand. Alexander became an unexpected ally, checking in periodically to make sure I was handling the family dynamics okay. He never again mentioned my classified background, but his treatment of me carried a respect that was noticeable to anyone paying attention. I focused on my work, threw myself into new assignments, built stronger relationships with colleagues who understood and valued what I brought to the mission. The validation I'd spent years seeking from my father came instead from peers who knew excellence when they saw it. But the situation with Dad remained unresolved, a low-level tension that colored every interaction. He seemed confused by my new boundaries, uncertain how to relate to me now that I'd made it clear I wouldn't accept dismissive treatment. I realized I was waiting for something, an acknowledgement, an apology, some sign that he understood how his words had affected me. But weeks passed without any indication that he was prepared to revisit the conversation we'd had or examine the assumptions that had shaped his view of my service. The stalemate felt sustainable in the short term, but I knew it couldn't continue indefinitely. Either we'd find a way to rebuild our relationship on more honest ground, or we'd drift further apart until family gatherings became mere obligations rather than meaningful connections. I wasn't sure which outcome was more likely, or which one I was prepared to accept. The breaking point came in December, during what should have been a routine family phone call. I'd been back at base for 6 weeks, settling into a new assignment that brought different challenges, but similar satisfaction. Life had found its rhythm again, the earlier family drama fading into background noise. Dad called on a Sunday evening, which was unusual. Our conversations typically happened when Mom called and handed him the phone, brief exchanges about weather and work that stayed safely on the surface of things. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, without any of the usual small talk. "About the ceremony, about how I talked about your service." I felt my pulse quicken, but kept my voice neutral. "Okay. I talked to some people. Veterans I know, guys who served in different conflicts. Asked them about different types of military roles, different ways people serve." I waited, not sure where he was heading, but sensing this conversation was going to be different from our usual careful exchanges. "The thing is," he continued, "I realize I don't really understand what you do over there. What you've been doing all these years. I assumed it was support work, administrative stuff, not because I think less of that, but because you never talked about anything else." The admission surprised me. For years, our conversations about my military service had been surface level because I'd assumed he wasn't interested in details. I'd never considered that he might interpret my discretion as evidence that my work wasn't particularly significant. "A lot of what I do is classified," I said carefully. "I can't discuss operational details." "I understand that now. But I think I missed something important. When you said I don't respect your service, that I only value Alexander's contributions, that hit me harder than you might think." I felt something shift between us, a slight opening in the wall that had been building for months. "Dad, when you introduced me at that ceremony, you made it sound like my service was adequate but not distinguished. Then you talked about Alexander like he represented real military achievement. In front of the whole community." He was quiet for a long moment. "I hear you saying that, and I keep trying to remember exactly what I said. But I think you're right about how it sounded, regardless of what I meant. It wasn't a full apology, but it was acknowledgement. More than I'd expected and more than I'd gotten in years of trying to earn his recognition. The thing is," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I have been distinguished in my service. I can't give you details, but my work has mattered in ways that go beyond just doing my best." "How would I know that if you never told me?" The question caught me off guard. He was right. I'd never shared anything that would help him understand the significance of my assignments or the recognition I'd received from commanders and colleagues. "I assumed you weren't interested," I said honestly. "When I tried to talk about my work, you'd change the subject or make comments about how different the military was in your generation." "Jesus," he said quietly. "We really screwed this up, didn't we?" The admission was so unexpected that I felt tears welling up. After years of feeling dismissed and undervalued, hearing him acknowledge that we'd both contributed to the misunderstanding felt like a door opening. "Maybe we can fix it," I said. "I'd like to try. But I need you to help me understand what I missed, what I should have been seeing all these years." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and it was enough to make me want to try rebuilding the relationship. We talked for another hour, carefully navigating around classified information while I tried to give him a sense of the work I'd been doing and the recognition it had earned. He listened without interrupting, asked thoughtful questions, seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than just getting through the conversation. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope that my relationship with my father might actually be reparable. But hope and reality don't always align, and I learned that lesson over the following months. Dad made efforts. He asked about my work when we talked, showed interest in my assignments in ways he never had before. But there was still a careful quality to our interactions, as if we were both walking on eggshells, afraid to disturb the fragile progress we'd made. The real test came during my next leave home. I'd been nervous about the visit, wondering if the ground we'd covered in phone conversations would hold up to face-to-face interaction. When I walked through the door, Dad hugged me, not the perfunctory embrace I'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer, more substantial. "Good to have you home," he said, and I could hear that he meant it. Over dinner that first night, he asked questions about my current assignment, listened to my carefully edited responses with attention I wasn't used to receiving from him. Mom watched these exchanges with obvious relief, clearly happy to see us interacting without the underlying tension that had characterized our relationship for so long. But I could also sense his struggle. Years of thinking about my military service, in one way, don't disappear overnight. When Alexander and my sister joined us later that week, I watched Dad's behavior carefully, looking for signs that he was falling back into old patterns of elevating Alexander's achievements while minimizing mine. To his credit, he seemed to be making conscious efforts to include me in military-related conversations, to acknowledge my experience alongside Alexander's. But the effort was visible, which made it feel somehow artificial. I appreciated the intention while recognizing that genuine respect can't be willed into existence. Alexander noticed the shift too. During a quiet moment while Dad was outside working in his garage, Alexander asked me how I felt about the changes in family dynamics. "It's better," I said honestly. "But it feels fragile. Like he's trying to be different because he knows he should, not because he actually sees me differently." Alexander nodded. "Change takes time. The important thing is that he's trying." But I wasn't sure trying was enough. Respect that has to be consciously maintained isn't the same as respect that comes naturally. I found myself analyzing Dad's words and actions, looking for evidence of genuine change versus performed adjustment. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, during a conversation that had nothing to do with military service. Dad was telling a story about a problem at one of his construction sites, a complex engineering challenge that had stumped his crew. As he described the issue, I recognized parallels to logistical problems I'd solved in various deployments. Without thinking, I offered suggestions based on my experience managing complex operations in resource-constrained environments. Dad listened, asked follow-up questions, then started taking notes. For 20 minutes, we worked through the problem together, my operational experience complementing his construction expertise. When we finished, he looked at me with something I'd rarely seen in his eyes, recognition of my competence as an equal, not his daughter trying to prove herself, but a professional whose judgment he valued. "That's exactly what we need," he said. I wouldn't have thought of approaching it that way. It was a small moment, but it felt more significant than all the careful conversations we'd had about military service. For the first time in years, he'd seen me as someone whose expertise could help him solve a real problem. Over the remainder of that visit, I noticed subtle changes in how he talked about my military experience. Less forced interest, more natural curiosity. He started asking questions that suggested he was beginning to understand the complexity of what I did, even without knowing classified details. The shift wasn't complete or perfect, but it was real. I left that visit feeling like we'd turned a corner, that the foundation was being laid for a different kind of relationship. But I also left with a clearer understanding of what had gone wrong between us for so many years. Dad's dismissal of my service hadn't been born of malice or conscious favoritism. It had grown out of genuine ignorance about what my work entailed, combined with assumptions about military roles that led him to undervalue contributions he didn't understand. My own secrecy about operational details, motivated by legitimate security concerns, had inadvertently reinforced his misconceptions. He'd filled in the gaps in his knowledge with assumptions that diminished rather than elevated my service. Alexander's recognition of my classified background had forced a reckoning with those assumptions, but the real change had come when Dad began to see my competence in contexts he could understand and evaluate. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress. Enough progress to make me want to continue working on the relationship rather than giving up on it entirely. The months that followed tested our new dynamic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dad started mentioning my military service in conversations with friends and neighbors, but his references carried a respect that hadn't been there before. When people asked about my work, he'd say things like, She does important work overseas, can't talk about the details, but it's significant stuff. It wasn't the enthusiastic pride I'd once craved, but it was acknowledgement. More importantly, it was honest. He didn't understand exactly what I did, but he'd stopped assuming it wasn't important. The real validation came from an unexpected source. Dad's friend Mike, a Vietnam veteran, approached me at a family barbecue and said something that caught me completely off guard. "Your dad's been talking about your service lately," Mike said quietly. "Sounds like you're doing the kind of work we needed more of when I was over there. Important stuff that doesn't get recognition but makes everything else possible." I looked across the yard to where Dad was manning the grill and realized he'd been talking about my service in terms that conveyed respect rather than dismissal. The change wasn't just in our direct interactions, it was in how he represented me to his social circle. That fall, I received orders for a new assignment that would take me back to Afghanistan. It was a promotion, recognition of my experience and capabilities, but it also meant another long deployment with limited communication home. When I told my family, Dad's reaction surprised me. Instead of the resigned acceptance I'd grown accustomed to, he asked questions about the timing, the duration, whether I had everything I needed for the deployment. "Is this dangerous work?" he asked directly. I gave him the standard response I'd learned to give family members, that all military service involves some risk, but we're trained and equipped to handle it. But Dad persisted. "I'm not asking for classified information. I'm asking as your father whether you're going into a situation where I should be worried about you." The directness of the question, and the concern behind it, made me realize how much our relationship had evolved. He was asking not because he was looking for reasons to discourage me, but because he wanted to understand what supporting me actually meant. "Yes," I said simply. "You should be worried about me. But you should also be proud of me, because I'm good at what I do and it matters." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll worry and be proud at the same time." It was the most honest exchange we'd had about my military service, and it set the tone for how we handled that deployment. Dad didn't pretend to understand my work, but he stopped pretending it wasn't significant. His concern was real, his pride was growing more genuine, and his support felt substantial rather than obligatory. During that deployment, our phone conversations took on a different quality. He asked about conditions, about whether I was staying safe, about how the work was going in general terms. I could hear in his voice that he was thinking about me as someone doing important work rather than someone going through the motions of military service. When I came home on leave, the change was even more apparent. Dad introduced me to people not as my daughter who joined the army, but as my daughter who serves overseas. A small distinction, but one that acknowledged my service as ongoing and significant rather than something I'd done and moved on from. The relationship wasn't perfect. Years of misunderstanding don't disappear overnight. But it was functional, respectful, and growing stronger. I no longer felt like I was performing for his approval or swallowing his dismissal. We were building something more honest and sustainable. Alexander remained an important ally in this process, but his role had evolved too. Instead of being the uncomfortable keeper of secrets about my classified background, he became a bridge between Dad's growing curiosity about military service and my need to maintain operational security. He could answer general questions about military culture and career progression without venturing into areas I couldn't discuss. More importantly, Alexander had learned to navigate family gatherings without feeling like he had to compensate for Dad's previous dismissal of my service. The dynamic had become more balanced, with room for both of our military experiences to be acknowledged and respected. By the time that deployment ended, I felt like I had my father back. Not the father I'd imagined as a child, who would automatically be proud of everything I did, but a real father who was learning to understand and respect who I'd become. The transformation hadn't happened through dramatic confrontations or forced reckonings with past hurt. It had happened through honest conversations, gradual recognition, and the slow work of rebuilding trust that had been eroded over years of misunderstanding. Looking back, I realized that both Dad and I had contributed to the problem. His assumptions about my work had been shaped by ignorance, but my secrecy had made it impossible for him to correct those assumptions. We'd both been operating from incomplete information, making judgments based on misunderstanding rather than reality. The solution hadn't been to abandon boundaries or reveal classified information. It had been to find ways to communicate respect and recognition within the constraints we both faced. Dad had learned to acknowledge the significance of work he couldn't fully understand, while I'd learned to help him see my competence in contexts where he could evaluate it directly. Years later, when people ask me about family relationships and military service, I tell them that respect has to be built on understanding, but understanding doesn't require complete information. What matters is the willingness to acknowledge that there might be more to someone's story than you currently know, and the humility to adjust your assumptions when evidence suggests they might be wrong. Dad and I found our way to that understanding, but it took time, patience, and the recognition that we both had work to do to repair what had been damaged between us. The final validation of our rebuilt relationship came 3 years later at another community event honoring veterans. Dad had been asked to speak again, and this time I was home on leave to attend. I sat in the audience, watching him approach the podium with the same confidence he'd always carried in public speaking situations. But when he began his remarks about family and military service, the tone was completely different from that devastating speech years earlier. Military service takes many forms, he said, looking directly at me for a moment. Some serve in ways that get public recognition, and others serve in ways that remain invisible to most of us. Both kinds of service matter, and both deserve our respect and gratitude. He went on to talk about Alexander's achievements, but with context that acknowledged different types of military contribution rather than creating hierarchies of value. When he mentioned my service, it was with genuine pride and respect for work he didn't claim to fully understand, but had learned to appreciate. After the event, people approached both Alexander and me with questions about our experiences, treating us as equally valuable sources of perspective on military life. The community's perception had shifted along with Dad's, recognizing that military service encompasses a broad range of roles and contributions. Walking to the car after the ceremony, Dad put his arm around my shoulder and said something that felt like the completion of a long journey. "I'm proud of you." I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of who you are and what you've accomplished. It was the recognition I'd waited for through years of disappointment and frustration, but receiving it felt different than I'd imagined. Instead of vindication or triumph, I felt something quieter and more substantial, the satisfaction of a relationship that had been broken and repaired, of respect that had been earned and acknowledged. "Thanks, Dad," I said. "That means a lot." And it did mean a lot, but not because it filled some desperate need for approval. It meant a lot because it represented genuine understanding and authentic relationship rather than the performance of family dynamics that had characterized our interactions for so long. The story of the ghost of Kandahar had become secondary to the story of a father and daughter learning to see each other clearly, to build respect on honest ground, and to value each other's contributions without needing to understand every detail. In the end, that was a better resolution than any dramatic revelation or forced acknowledgement could have provided. It was real, sustainable, and strong enough to withstand the complexities of family relationships and the unique challenges of military service. We'd found our way back to each other, not by erasing the past, but by building something better on the foundation of what we'd learned from our mistakes. And that, I realized, was exactly the kind of victory worth fighting for. But life has a way of testing the strength of rebuilt relationships, and ours faced its biggest challenge 2 years after that community ceremony. I was between deployments, stationed stateside for an extended training assignment, when Dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The call came from Mom on a Tuesday evening. Her voice was steady but strained as she explained the diagnosis, the treatment plan, the uncertain prognosis that comes with any cancer diagnosis in a man approaching 70. "He doesn't want to make a big deal of it," she said. "You know how he is about appearing weak or needing help." I didn't know how he was, and I also knew that this diagnosis would force all of us to confront mortality and legacy in ways we hadn't had to before. The question was whether our rebuilt relationship was strong enough to handle that kind of pressure. I requested emergency leave and drove home the next day. When I walked into the house, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with medical paperwork spread in front of him, reading treatment options with the same methodical attention he'd once brought to construction blueprints. He looked up when I entered, and I saw something in his expression I'd rarely seen before: vulnerability. Not just physical vulnerability from the diagnosis, but emotional vulnerability at being seen in a moment of uncertainty and fear. "Mom told me," I said simply, taking a seat across from him. "What do the doctors think?" We spent the next hour going through medical reports, treatment timelines, statistical probabilities. Dad approached his cancer diagnosis like a project to be managed, breaking down complex information into actionable steps. But I could see the worry beneath his practical demeanor, the fear he was working to keep under control. "The thing is," he said finally, "this makes you think about things you haven't finished. Conversations you should have had, things you should have said." I felt my chest tighten, wondering if he was leading up to some deathbed confession or dramatic reconciliation speech. But that wasn't Dad's style, and it wasn't how our relationship worked anymore. "What kinds of things?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking out the kitchen window at the yard he'd maintained for 30 years. "I keep thinking about that ceremony a few years back. The one where I said those things about your service. Dad, we worked through that. We're good now." "I know we worked through it," he said. "But I don't think I ever really explained what happened in my head that night, why I said what I said." I waited, not sure I needed to revisit that painful evening, but recognizing that he seemed to need to talk about it. The truth is, I was intimidated by Alexander. Here's this special forces guy, decorated, respected, and he's married to my daughter. I wanted to show him that our family understood military service, that we appreciated what he'd accomplished. He paused, running his hands through graying hair that had gotten thinner since his diagnosis. "So I built him up, made him the centerpiece of my remarks. And in doing that, I made you smaller. Not because I thought less of your service, but because I was so focused on impressing him that I forgot you were listening too." The explanation surprised me with its honesty. I'd assumed his dismissal had been about genuine assessment of our relative military contributions. Learning that it had been more about social performance and insecurity added a different dimension to the hurt. "It was still wrong," I said. "It was completely wrong. And the worst part is that I didn't even realize how wrong until you called me on it months later." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us processing this new layer of understanding about an old wound. Outside, Mom was working in her garden, giving us space to have whatever conversation we needed to have. "There's something else," Dad said eventually. "Something I learned after that phone call where you tried to help me understand your work better." I raised an eyebrow, curious where this was heading. "I did some research. Asked some questions of people who might know things. Carefully, without mentioning your name or any specifics." My stomach tightened. "Dad, you need to be careful about, I know." I was careful. But I needed to understand whether my ignorance about your work was just ignorance, or whether there was more to it. He looked at me directly, and I saw recognition in his eyes that made me realize this conversation was heading somewhere I hadn't expected. I found out enough to know that I was more wrong than I ever imagined. Not just about undervaluing your service, but about how significantly I undervalued it. The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we should cross. I'd spent years keeping my classified work separate from family relationships, and here was Dad indicating he'd learned enough to understand the magnitude of what he'd dismissed. "I can't discuss," I began. "I'm not asking you to discuss anything," he interrupted. "I'm telling you that I learned enough to realize that when I called Alexander the real military achievement in our family, I was not just wrong but embarrassingly wrong." The admission was so complete and unexpected that I felt tears welling up. Not tears of vindication or triumph, but tears of recognition that this man who had shaped so much of my need for approval had finally understood what he'd missed. "The thing that haunts me," he continued, "is that you knew all along how wrong I was, but you never corrected me. Never demanded the recognition you'd earned. You just accepted my ignorance and tried to build a relationship despite it." "It wasn't my place to demand recognition," I said quietly. "Maybe not demand it, but you deserve to receive it. And I failed you in that." We talked until late that evening, processing years of misunderstanding with the clarity that comes from facing mortality. Dad's cancer diagnosis had forced him to confront not just his own limitations, but the limitations of how he'd understood and valued the people closest to him. Over the following months, as he underwent treatment, our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't expected. The roles reversed somewhat. I became the one offering support and practical assistance, while he became more open about his fears, his regrets, his hopes for whatever time he had left. The treatment was successful. Dad's cancer went into remission, and his prognosis improved significantly. But the experience changed him in lasting ways. He became more direct about expressing appreciation, more conscious about not taking relationships for granted, more aware of how his words and assumptions affected the people he cared about. He also became something of an advocate for military families, speaking at local events about the challenges of understanding and supporting service members whose work can't be fully shared with family. His speeches now carried humility and nuance that had been missing from his earlier public remarks. Military families make sacrifices we don't always see, he'd say. Service members make contributions we don't always understand. Our job isn't to judge the significance of their work, it's to trust that their commitment and sacrifice matter, even when we can't know the details. Listening to him speak this way, I realized that our relationship had come full circle. The man whose approval I'd once desperately sought had become someone who understood that approval should be based on trust and respect rather than complete knowledge. The cancer scare also brought our extended family closer together. Alexander and my sister moved back to town when Dad was going through treatment, and for the first time, family gatherings felt genuinely comfortable for everyone involved. Alexander no longer carried the burden of secret knowledge about my service record, because the general principle of respecting unacknowledged contributions had become part of how our family operated. Dad's evolution had made Alexander's specific knowledge less relevant and less isolating. My sister, who had been somewhat peripheral to the military dynamics that had complicated our family relationships, found herself playing a bridge-building role that brought out the best in all of us. 2 years after Dad's recovery, I received notification that I was being awarded a commendation for my cumulative service contributions. The award ceremony would be held at the Pentagon, and family members were invited to attend. I called Dad to tell him about the ceremony, expecting him to decline due to travel difficulties or scheduling conflicts. Instead, he immediately asked for details about timing and location. "I wouldn't miss it," he said simply. "This is important." The ceremony was small and understated, the kind of recognition that acknowledges significant work without revealing classified details. Dad sat in the audience with Mom, watching as I received an award that represented years of service he'd never fully understood, but had learned to respect. Afterward, at the reception, several of my colleagues approached him to express appreciation for my contributions to various operations and missions. Dad listened with obvious pride, but also with the humility of someone who understood he was hearing about achievements that went far beyond anything he'd previously comprehended. "Your daughter is quite remarkable," one of my commanding officers told him. "Her work has had impact in ways that most people will never know about." Dad nodded seriously. "I'm learning that about her," he said. "Better late than never." On the flight home, we talked about the ceremony, the recognition, what it meant for my career going forward. But the conversation that mattered most happened when we were back in his kitchen, sitting at the same table where we'd had so many difficult conversations over the years. "I want you to know something," he said. "Today wasn't about me finally getting to see your achievements recognized. Today was about me getting to be present for recognition you'd already earned long before I understood what you'd accomplished." The distinction mattered. He wasn't claiming credit for finally appreciating me. He was acknowledging that my worth hadn't depended on his recognition, and that his recognition was simply catching up to reality. "I'm proud of you," he continued. "I should have been saying that all along, but I'm saying it now, and I mean it completely." It was the resolution I'd needed without knowing I needed it. Not dramatic vindication or public correction of past dismissals, but quiet acknowledgement and genuine respect between two people who had learned to see each other clearly. That night showed me something I should have learned long ago: you don't need someone else's approval to know your own worth. My father's words cut deep, but the truth came out anyway. Have you ever been written off by someone close, only to prove them wrong in the end? How did you handle it? Did it change the way you saw them or yourself? If this story resonated, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your respect.